This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international programme of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett and today I'm joined by someone who's written more than a dozen episodes of Star Trek and has recently moved into short fiction as well. It's Lisa Klink. Hi Lisa, how are you?
Hi there, how are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad. How are things for you?
Oh, going pretty well. It stopped raining finally.
Oh really, we've had a lot of rain here today as well. It's been like Ferenginar.
Now, in a way, it's not usual, but we had some pretty bad rain for a couple of weeks here, but it's lovely today.
Yeah, the reason that I got in touch with you, actually, was, funnily enough, because I saw you in the inaugural edition of Star Trek Explorer magazine, and I thought, oh, there's a name that I haven't heard about for a while. And I thought, she's someone who would have an interesting perspective on, actually working on Star Trek. How was it that you came to writing the short fiction? Did they approach you, or did you approach them, or how did that come about?
They approached me, actually, and asked if I would like to write a short story about Q. And I said, well, that sounds like fun. And it was. I really had a good time writing it.
I bet. Yeah, it's a great story. For anyone who hasn't yet got a copy of, issue 1 of Star Trek Explorer, it's well worth checking out. And I guess, although you have written over a dozen episodes of Star Trek, you never got to write for Q on screen. So it must be kind of a real treat to get to write for him in print. Oh,
absolutely. Q is a whole lot of fun.
I bet. And coming back soon as well. I mean, I don't know if you've been watching Star Trek Picard, if you've seen season 1, but pretty soon we're getting the return of Q, I think.
Yes, I'm really looking forward to it. I think that his dynamic with Picard is the best. I mean, I had the choice to write Q with any cast, and I chose the Next Generation cast because I really wanted to see him spar with Picard a little more.
Absolutely, yeah. Although Janeway had a kind of interesting dynamic with Q, I think. I think that kind of helped because Kate Mulgrew and John Delancey were quite good friends, as I understand it. So
yes.
They had a real rapport kind of straight out of the gate. But yeah, obviously it's Q and Picard is the that's the kind of core relationship, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So tell me a little bit about how you first got involved with Trek, because I think, although we think of you maybe more as a Voyager writer, it was actually Deep Space Nine that you started on, and you were an intern on that show, is that right?
I was. I did a Writers Guild internship on Deep Space Nine, which was fantastic. It was like, 8 weeks of grad school. I got to sit in on staff meetings and pitch meetings and go to production meetings, and it was a really good education. So I actually pitched them a bunch of stories, and they bought a story from me and had me write the episode Hippocratic Oath. And that turned out very well. And at the same time, they were looking for staff writers on Star Trek Voyager. So Ira Stephen Bear passed along my script to Jerry Taylor and recommended me, and they hired me on staff at Voyager.
So just talk me through a little bit about, starting off as an intern. I mean, what did that mean? Were you making the coffee? Were you holding the whiteboard marker? What does the intern do in that kind of a situation? Because I suppose we're used these days to the idea of interns in offices and so on, but a writing intern, what does that involve? Is it a creative job? Is it a kind of shadowing experience? Is it, really being kind of the dog's body who they can get to do whatever they don't feel like doing themselves, the coffee run or whatever? Give me a bit of an idea of what that's like.
Well, it wasn't so creative as it was shadowing. I got to sit in on the writer's room when they were having their story meetings, and I was the one at the whiteboard with the dry erase marker. So I was taking notes, and basically I just got to see the stories take shape, which was fantastic. I also got to sit in on pitch meetings, and so I got to see what the writers responded to in terms of stories. And I got to go down to the set and watch them shooting, because it was on, we were on the Paramount lot, and so I just had to basically walk across the lot to go watch them shoot. And I got to go to production meetings where they were talking about, budget and schedule and costuming and sets, and it was a fantastic education. I'm really glad I did it.
I bet. And obviously, the DS9 writers' room is sort of famous in Star Trek history these days as this kind of, this sort of crucible of amazing ideas. I mean, they were really innovating. They were pushing Trek in new directions around that time.
Yes, I really was very lucky to be in the Deep Space Nine writers' room. And as you mentioned, all of those writers have gone on to do wonderful things. And they were very accepting. I mean, I was the only woman in the room, and I never felt excluded. I never felt like I was just the intern. I really felt like I was involved.
So could you, while you're standing at the whiteboard with the pen in hand, I mean, are you free to chip in ideas at that level, or do you have to just kind of keep quiet and write down what other people say?
I mostly kept quiet. Sometimes I would suggest ideas, but it was generally when there was a lull and nobody was saying anything, then sometimes I might pipe up. But I knew that my purpose was not to be another writer in the room.
But was there an expectation that by the time you came to the end of the internship, you would try to sell a story yourself? I mean, was that the kind of obvious goal going into that, or was that very much an outside chance?
No, it was definitely the goal to sell a story. And because they had gotten to know me during the past 8 weeks as a writer, they actually let me write the story instead of just buying it from me and writing it in-house. So I was very lucky to get that opportunity.
That's amazing. So how did that come about? Were you pitching ideas to them regularly? I mean, were you, going home at night and coming up with story ideas constantly to try and tempt them?
Well, I had actually already been pitching before the internship. I had been in to pitch, I think, 3 or 4 times. And then, obviously, during the internship, when I got to hear them taking pitches from other writers, it gave me a lot better idea of what they were looking for and how to pitch better. And so I pitched a lot more successfully, once I had seen it happening in front of my face.
Right. That's interesting. So you've been sort of on the other side of the table or the other side of the room.
Mm-hmm.
So had you written a spec script originally then? What was the kind of process to get into the room and being allowed to pitch?
Yes, I'd written a spec Next Generation and sent that in. Even before then, I had gone to a Star Trek convention in which they had a writers panel. And I believe it was like Ron Moore, Brandon Raga, Joe Menosky, and they were talking about how they would accept spec scripts. And they were the only show in town that would do that. And in fact, nobody does it anymore. And so I thought, well, I like Next Generation. I can write a spec for that. So I did, and I sent it in. And fortunately, I had no idea that they got thousands and thousands of scripts like that every year. But I was lucky. I got read by an intern, and they recommended me for coming in to pitch.
So what was the spec script about that you wrote for them?
It was centered on Geordi, and there was a race of telepathic aliens on board. And because of his visor, he was the only one who could understand them or pick up their telepathy. But they were very emotional and overwhelming, and so he had to work with Troy to learn to be a bit of an empath himself. That's
interesting, and that's quite an unusual pairing for Next Gen as well, I think.
Well, that's what I was after, was I wanted to take the chief engineer and put him in a different kind of situation.
And then, obviously, so when it came to Deep Space Nine, so you're working there, you've been pitching ideas to them for a while. And what was it about this one idea for Hippocratic Oath that sort of pushed it over the line? Because I think it was a story was partly yours and partly someone else was pitching. Is that right? There was kind of 2 angles coming together there.
They did end up blending it with another pitch, yes. But I had never actually heard that pitch, but I guess I had it sort of waiting in the wings and decided to combine it with mine. It's funny because I remember I came in with this really long, worked-out story about Bashir getting thrown into this alien prison, and he had to kill, survive, and it was this very detailed story. And they took 3 words out of it. They took Bashir in jail. And so we started from that premise, and we started talking about other, prisoner of war movies like, Stalag 17 and, The Great Escape and stuff like that. And we ended up kind of modeling the story after Bridge Over the River Kwai, with Bashir as the Alec Guinness character and O'Brien as the William Holden character. And then we had them get captured by the Dominion, by the Jem'Hadar. And the story kind of developed from there.
So how does that happen if you say they take, the real bare bones of your story and then they say, and we want you to combine it with this? Does someone then give you like a an outline or a paragraph on what it is that you're doing? Or do you know what I mean? How does that... What's your starting point then to actually go and start writing the thing?
Well, fortunately, Deep Space Nine and Voyager have a writer's room in which we break down the stories together. So we'll start with the premise, whether it's, 3 words or whether it's a whole paragraph that we've bought from a writer. And you stand in front of the whiteboard and you work out, okay, scene 1, teaser, who's there, what happens? In Act 1, scene 1, what happens? And so you develop a really specific, detailed outline. And then as the writer, you take that really specific outline and you go off and write the first draft. And ideally, you'll have a couple of weeks to write the first draft, and then bring it back, and everybody gives you notes, and then you go off and do a rewrite. And again, I was very lucky in that I had a chance to do the first rewrite myself. And then Ron Moore took it over after that, which I thought was great, because I love Ron. I think he's very talented, and so I was really happy to have him working on my script after me. And he added a lot of really nice stuff.
Someone else who got their career started thanks to a spec script for Next Gen, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah, amazing. So were you involved in breaking the story then? Were you in the writer's room at that point? As an intern or as a writer, or how did that work? Or did they kind of take over and then give it back to you?
Yes, as a writer, I was in the room when we broke it, and they had the current intern, standing up at the board with the dry erase marker. So at that point, I had moved up in the ranks.
Wow, that must have been quite exciting then to be, I guess on the sofa rather than at the board.
Absolutely.
There must be an enormous amount of pressure then after, you've all worked on this story together, you've come up with the outline or whatever, you've broken the story, and then you've got to go away and, lock yourself in a room presumably and actually hammer it out. I mean, how detailed is the brief that you've got at that point? I mean, you know which scenes are happening where and so on, kind of what all the key beats are, but you presumably still have some creative leeway in how you tell the story, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, with the dialogue, you have a scene that says, Bashir and O'Brien are in the shuttlecraft out on a mission. And so you have to come up with, what is the mission? And, what is the dialogue? Or what are they saying to each other? How do you establish that relationship? And how is it going to change over the course of the episode? So there's certainly a lot of leeway. It was a really good experience.
It's funny when you say that, it reminds me, there's that great line in that opening conversation in the runabout where O'Brien basically says to Bashir, why can't Keiko, you think he's going to say, why can't she be more like you? And he says, why can't Keiko be more like a man?
Right.
I mean, that kind, which really is a fantastic bit of dialogue, I think, because it really gets to the heart of that kind of bromance and also, Miles as a character, and so on. So, yeah, I suppose a lot of the texture of, obviously people love Deep Space Nine for its, big arcs and the war and all this kind of stuff, but they also adore those characters, I think, and that kind of level of, sort of detail and the small elements as well as the big elements.
Yes, and if you don't care what happens to the characters, then it doesn't matter how great the sci-fi concept is. You really have to, it has to matter to the people that you really are affectionate about. And
you managed in that episode, you had 2 great pairings, because you had O'Brien and Bashir, who we know as this kind of romance couple in a sense, but you end up sort of turning that on its head and making things quite tough for them. But then you've also got Odo and Worf having this fantastic B story. And weirdly, it only struck me when I watched it this week, they both resolve with a disagreement that is then covered up. Both Odo and Bashir deliberately kind of keep their antagonists' misdemeanors away from scrutiny to some extent. They both kind of brush them under the carpet. I thought that was really interesting. That you've got these 2 separate stories, but there are definite parallels between them. Well, ideally, that's what you want, is you want to have the B story echo the A story in some way, even if it's, just thematic or character relationships. Right, that's interesting. And was that a kind of understood rule on Trek or just in script writing generally? I know Michael Piller was quite keen on all these sorts of things on Next Gen, but I was interested that would carry over to Deep Space Nine, because I sort of thought sometimes on DS9 it feels like the A and the B stories are wildly different things that just happen to be happening at the same time. Yeah, you don't always get what you shoot for, but ideally you want it to be related, but sometimes it just doesn't quite work out that way. And what about the drug addiction aspect of the story? Was that something that you researched when you were working on that? Is there time when you're bashing out one of these stories to kind of go and think, where can I find inspiration for something like this? Because it certainly, in the way that it's directed and acted and so on, it sort of feels like those actors have kind of watched people, coming off some kind of drugs. I don't know. Do you know what I mean? It feels like there's an element of reality there. I'm curious whether for you as the writer, that's something that you're kind of going out and searching for.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the more you can tie it into the reality of non-sci-fi experience, the better. You want to make it a metaphor for something that people might be encountering in their real lives.
And that's, I suppose, one of the things with Star Trek in particular, isn't it? Is it's often operating on two levels at once. Mm-hmm. You've got the kind of sci-fi, futuristic stuff, and then you've got the kind of morality play or the, hard-hitting, relatable drama or whatever. And you're always trying to... You need to kind of keep them both in balance somehow. You need to kind of keep both of those elements working in the story.
Yeah, I believe that's when Star Trek and sci-fi in general, I think that's when it's really working well, is when it sort of comments on contemporary society or contemporary character issues.
So tell me a little bit about how you ended up jumping over to Voyager, because I think that was an unexpected surprise, right? This show, it must have started by that point, I think, because you joined in the second season. But how did that come about? They were looking for an extra writer and you got the call to say, would you join them?
Yeah, basically, it was a total surprise to me. I mean, what I found out later was that Ira, had passed on my script to Jerry Taylor because he knew that she was looking for a staff writer. But first I heard of it was I got the phone call from Jerry Taylor, saying, would you like to be on staff at Voyager? I think my response was, really? But yes, she assured me it was a real offer, and I absolutely jumped at the chance. It was my first, staff gig, as you might guess, and it was absolutely a wonderful experience. I was very lucky to start there, kind of start at the top.
And how did that happen? Did you have to have an interview or anything, or did they just offer you the job then and there?
Well, what I didn't realize was that Ira Bear had passed over my script to Jerry Taylor and said, if you're looking for a staff writer, maybe you should check her out. And she read the script, and I guess she liked it because she called me and said, would you like to come on Voyager? And I think my response was, really? But yes, in fact, it was a real offer, and I started, I believe, the next week.
Wow, gosh, that must have been a baptism of fire in a way.
Yes, it was wonderful, though. It was a really good show, and Jerry was a wonderful showrunner. So I kind of started at the top, a really functional, good show that I knew would get picked up, for the next season. It wasn't going to get canceled anytime soon. So it was a really good place to start. Sure.
So you had, I guess, Michael Piller still there, I think, when you joined, maybe, and Jerry Taylor, but there was a transition.
Michael Piller was still there for my first year on Voyager, yes.
Did you know she was going to take over, in a sense? Was she? Yeah.
Yes. We knew that Jerry was going to take over in the fifth season of the show.
In the third season.
I'm sorry, third season, yes.
And I was kind of curious, because obviously, so you came on board, and it seems to me like you were there for sort of Jerry's heyday, and then you left sort of around the same time that she did. I mean, was that just a coincidence, or were you sort of her person? Do you know what I mean? Was there a kind of sense of that? Did people have, was she your mentor and you were her sort of,
she was definitely...
maybe I'm reaching here, but I'm just curious what the kind of dynamics were.
She was definitely my mentor, and I really learned a lot from her, especially about how to run a good show. And she really kind of helped me become a professional writer, basically, from being a freelancer.
And what was her room like compared to Ira's, for example? I mean, was it quite a different environment? I guess there were two women in this instance, and one of them in a more senior position, as befits, Voyager in some ways. What was the atmosphere different? Was the kind of work going on there different, would you say? I mean, obviously the shows...
I actually found the atmosphere pretty similar, which was great. Star Trek room was very open. Both Ira and Jerry really set a good standard of, you could always throw out suggestions, and even if it was a stupid idea, nobody would laugh at you for coming up with a stupid idea. And they would just take it and, well, how about this instead? Or, ooh, how about that? And it was very collaborative, and I never felt afraid to speak up in either of those rooms, which was really a blessing.
That's interesting. Yeah, when I spoke to Naran Shankar, he said that the motto was best idea wins, that there was this kind of, it was quite democratizing in some ways. Yeah, so that's
it really was. It really was. I mean, even me as the new staff writer, if I had the best idea, then Jerry would say, okay, let's go with that.
And as a staff writer, was there a kind of expectation? Because I noticed, just working my way through, I've done a little kind of Lisa Klink rewatch in the last few days, sort of blitzing through your episodes. And I noticed that the first ones that you do, they're always from someone else's story, or you're kind of rewriting something, or one of them even is an uncredited rewrite. And then as time goes on, you start having written by credits, which I guess means the whole thing is your baby from beginning to end. So was that sort of part of what was understood as that job, was that you'd be handed something and told, make this work, because we're not quite sure what to do with it or how to kind of deal with it or whatever?
Well, I think that as I gained more experience on the show, I think probably the ideas that I was coming up with were better ideas. Initially they gave me a lot of ideas that had been brought in by freelancers and people who had come in to pitch, because they knew that idea was something they wanted to go forward with. And then, as I said, as I gained experience, I was able to come up with more original ideas myself.
And so the first script that you worked on was Resistance,
yes.
Which was a script that had been submitted, or an idea that had been submitted by Michael Jan Friedman, I think, who many, or certainly, listeners of my age and above probably will remember as a big name in the Star Trek novels, kind of back in that era. And I think I read somewhere that you found it quite a tricky one to get going with to begin with, because of the dynamic between Janeway and this old man that she kind of befriends, who thinks she's his daughter, and how to kind of make it Janeway's story and not his story in some ways.
Yes, that really was the challenge, was how to keep Janeway at the middle of everything. Because, however interesting the guest characters are, it always has to be about, your heroes. So, yeah, that was really the marching orders on that episode, was keep it about Janeway.
And this episode, I don't know why, I'd never thought of this watching it, but I understand was based, from my reading around it, was based on Don Quixote, was the kind of inspiration. I mean, is that something, if you're aware of that as the writer being handed the idea, do you go and do a quick reread of Don Quixote? Or do you know what I mean? Is that at the back of your mind? when there's, as is often the case with Star Trek, that there is a kind of, like you mentioned Bridge Over the River Kwai before, there is a kind of, a linchpin or a foundation in literature, history, whatever it is. Yeah. I mean, is that something that you're kind of, is always there when you're writing it, or has that done its job by the time you kind of get down to it, if you know what I mean?
I think really it's just the inspiration. It's just kind of the jumping off point, because then we need to sort of make that universe into our universe and make our heroes the kind of the central figures. So it does serve as just a jumping off point. Ideally, I mean, obviously you don't want to be stick too close to the original story. You don't want to copy it. You just want to take it as a leaping off point. And
there was a scene in that episode which I gather was a bit of a controversial one, which is where Janeway gets into the prison by essentially pretending to be a prostitute. Now, this it's an unusual scene for Star Trek. I mean, we saw it in Next Gen, where I think Picard and Rolaren kind of played that dynamic in an episode right towards the end. But for the captain to actually, I suppose, be, using her sexuality in a sense, was an unusual step for her as a character, wasn't it?
It was. And there was a lot of conversation about that, about, could we come up with a better idea or a different idea? But it really seemed, ultimately, what it came down to is Janeway's practical. And if this would work, she would do it. And it worked.
And was there pushback then? I mean, was the debate within the writers' room? Was there pushback from producers or even from Kate? I mean, was there anxiety around it? Because I know Janeway's a character that it seems like there was endless anxiety about her hairstyle, her femininity, her, outfits, all of this kind of stuff. People were very anxious about getting it right.
I don't remember there being pushback from the actress. Really, the debate that I remember was within the room. And, Jerry Taylor in particular was really protective of Janeway and wanted to make sure that she wouldn't do anything that would really seem out of character for her. But like I said, we ultimately settled that Janeway would do what was necessary.
And this was the first of a couple of stories, of kind of space Nazi stories that you did, basically. I mean, these guys, they're dressed in black. They're real kind of fascists, basically. And then you went on to do Remember, which again is a kind of, much more overtly kind of World War II inflected story. And I've always been curious. Voyager has a lot. I mean, Deep Space Nine obviously had the whole, Cardassian occupation, all that kind of stuff going on in the background and sometimes in the foreground. But Voyager too seemed quite preoccupied with World War II and the Holocaust and the kind of legacy of that time. And I'm interested whether this is something that was consciously discussed in the room, or was that just part of the kind of zeitgeist at the time? Maybe because of the 50th anniversary, I guess, of the war, in the 90s. Was World War II something that seemed to kind of loom creatively?
Yeah, I don't recall having a specific discussion about, whether we wanted to stay in the World War II area. I think just as we were coming up with bad guys, the Nazis always are make for good bad guys and, alien versions of them as well. But it might be, as you said, kind of in the zeitgeist at the time, but it wasn't a deliberate effort to stick to that.
And I was interested watching Resistance and also Innocence and Sacred Ground. I mean, these are some fantastic episodes that you worked on. They're quite unusual, though, in some ways for Star Trek, because I think, and when I was talking to Robert Duncan McNeill a little while ago about Sacred Ground, one of the things I talked to him about was the pacing. They feel quite... No, I mean, if I say slow-paced, it sort of sounds like a negative thing, but they take their time. Do you know what I mean? They're not kind of action-adventure stories. They feel much more character-driven, right. Much more kind of... almost like a kind of, a theatre show or something. Do you know what I mean? That sort of seems a little bit more the direction they're going in. Was that something that was a deliberate decision on your part, or were those the kind of scripts that they tended to give you, or is that just a coincidence and, you get whatever's next on the plate?
Well, I think that I tended to be drawn toward character-driven stories, and those probably did tend to be a little more slow-paced. Brandon, for example, really liked, the kind of the shoot-'em-up sci-fi action stories, and so his scripts probably tended to be a little more quick-paced. But yeah, I think you could say that I was really drawn to the kind of the more character-driven episodes. And
Remember, actually, was a story from Brannon and Joe Menosky, I think, but then you ended up writing it. Why was that? Was that they'd come up with it, but they didn't fancy writing it themselves? They wanted to go and do, all guns blazing action extravaganzas, or why does that happen? That a writer doesn't carry their idea through, that they hand it over to someone else? Is it just scheduling, or what?
It's mostly scheduling. It's mostly because we would take turns. There were, I believe at the time there were 5 of us, 5 staff writers. And so basically when it was, I was up to do the next episode. And so if Brandon and Joe had a good idea, then they would just pass it along to me.
That is a really powerful episode, I think, Remember. And it's definitely, talking about World War II or whatever, I suppose it does have that real, it makes me think a little bit of, I know around the time of, I don't know when Schindler's List came out, whether that was around, I feel like it was sort of around that time. And I know that Spielberg was very concerned with these oral history projects and kind of gathering stories and testimony, and this sort of idea, which is of interest to me because I'm a historian who works on World War II through interviewing people, basically. So that kind of oral history approach really fascinates me. I'm curious whether that was sort of something that was in your mind when you were working on it. Do you know what I mean? That kind of contemporary concern. I suppose as people were getting older and there was this sense of, needing to record those stories of that generation.
Yeah, I'm sure it was in the back of my mind. I mean, I believe that the premise of the story started with the idea of B'Elanna having these very realistic dreams, and it turned out to be that they were the actual memories of some aliens. I think what those memories were, I think developed as we were in the story room and developing it. And obviously, we did have in mind, the Holocaust allegory.
And then just to go, from one leather-clad episode to another, you also got on a more sort of, I don't know what I was going to say, sort of more schlocky. Not that the episode is particularly, but less hard-hitting, maybe, let's say, a version of that. You got to do Warlord, which I think is a really fun episode. And also,
that was fun.
I was really struck watching it. Such a great episode for Jennifer Lean. Mm-hmm. And it reminded me, my favourite Keiko O'Brien episode in Deep Space Nine is the one where she's possessed by a power wraith, and it's just really horrible. And I sort of felt there was a similar element of like the actress who normally plays such a nice character getting to really be a badass and kind of a really unpleasant character. But that must have been quite a fun one to write.
Oh yes, it was definitely fun. I mean, when you take such, probably the sweetest character on the ship, Kes, and turn her the opposite way and say, what if she was taken over by this evil, tyrant? And so, yeah, obviously, taking her as far out of character as possible is fun. And then also getting to keep the actual character of Kes alive in their kind of mental duels, give her a little more to do. That was a lot of fun. And I think Jennifer really knocked it out of the park.
She did, absolutely. You also got a big responsibility in that episode. You got to break up Neelix and Kes, which is, I don't know. I'm curious to know what the feeling was in the writer's room by this point, because I know a lot of people these days don't love that relationship. I think they feel like it was, it was definitely, this episode was, needed to come along at some point and kind of separate the two of them. I mean, did that feel like a big responsibility, writing that breakup scene? Was it a relief? Was it a kind of burden? How did you feel about that?
Well, it wasn't so much a responsibility because it wasn't really my decision. It's not something that I came up with and said, hey, let's break them up. It's something that we had come up with in the room, and obviously Jerry Taylor, had approved. But how to do it was kind of interesting because Kes was actually, possessed at the time. And so you could argue that it wasn't really Kes who did the breaking up, but it kind of stuck anyway. So it was, I think, ended up being a little more ambiguous, and that if we had wanted to go back in the next episode and say, oh, that was just an alien, that wasn't really Kes, we could have. But we didn't. We had it stick.
Yeah, it's interesting, that one, that it kind of, maybe that guy did her a favour, by possessing her in that sense. In that, who knows? Maybe that would never have happened otherwise. But I mean, was that something that was? Because I guess one of the things people often talk about Voyager versus DS9 in terms of continuity, and certainly it seems to me the approach to continuity was quite different, but there was continuity in Voyager. There were stories that were kind of carrying forward, and often it feels to me like I was quite struck watching Dreadnought, which I know you did an uncredited rewrite on. There's the stuff about Tom Paris being late for meetings, and all this. There are these kind of breadcrumb moments of continuity somehow threaded through Voyager, but not the sense of chapters in a novel that you maybe get in DS9 to some extent.
Right.
But was that something, say that relationship, was there a sense that this isn't quite working, or we need to, were there fans even then saying, we don't like these two together, let's, why do they, why can't she go off with Paris, or why can't she, find someone more suitable, or younger at least?
I don't recall it being in response to the fans. I think that we felt in general just that the relationship had kind of gone as far as it was going to, and unless we wanted to have them get married and have kids, which nobody really wanted to do, then it seemed like it had kind of run its course.
And I suppose splitting them up opens her up for, other... Oh, and Neelix potentially up for, romantic interest storylines in a way that's not the case.
We wanted to leave them open for other relationships.
Just talking about Dreadnought, I was quite struck by that. So how does it come about? Just when I looked it up on Memory Alpha, it says uncredited rewrite. And I noticed digging into it that the credited writer on that was a producer, an executive, I think, at Paramount at the time. I mean, was that a kind of... Is that why that would come about, that you don't get the credit for the work that you've done? Because was there a sensitivity there that he's handed in this script and they're like, ooh, it's not quite what we need, but we don't want to ruffle any feathers, or what's going on there?
I don't recall there being a particular consideration for that writer. I mean, in general, we tried to give the freelance writers as much credit as possible. If they actually put in the work to write, a draft of the script, we wanted to honor that, because obviously, in terms of payment, they would get the full payment and the full residuals for it. And so, anytime you stick somebody else's name on it, then you suddenly split the payment. And that just didn't seem like a fair thing to do.
So then we've got, I think your first written by credit was Blood Fever. So does that mean that you came up with the story from beginning to end? And then, do you know what I mean? What does that mean? That you obviously you were in the room when they were breaking the story, but had you pitched that idea to them of doing a Ponfar episode? Is that where that came from?
Well, it's funny because obviously having Tuvok, having a Vulcan character on the show, there was always the idea of, in the back of our minds about doing a Ponfar episode with him. But when we came to talk about actually doing the episode, it was tricky to come up with a way to do it that hadn't been done before. That wasn't just going to be a copy of Amok Time from the original series. And I remember talking about it in the room, which characters maybe could we do it with? And we settled on B'Elanna because she always had kind of a similar, trying to keep her emotions, in her mind, her negative emotions suppressed. And so what would happen if those emotions were basically let out of the bag? And so she seemed like an interesting character to do it with. So I seem to remember that idea really came up out of the whole room, talking about doing a Ponfar episode rather than something that I pitched independently. But because we hadn't bought it from a freelancer and it was generated by the staff, I got the credit for it.
I see. Right. Okay. That's interesting. Right. And it's there's so much in that episode. I was really struck watching it again recently. I mean, there's all the stuff with B'Elanna and Tom, big sort of plot point there. You also throw in the Borg. It feels like there's kind of a lot going on, if you know what I mean. Was it a challenge to write, to kind of get all that into one story?
No, I remember that one being a lot of fun to write, actually. Having a lot of good material is a good thing. And it just gives you a lot of stuff to play with, rather than trying to stretch out one concept maybe longer than it can withstand. Having a lot of material really gives you a lot of good notes to hit. And
there were some quite last-minute rewrites, is that right? That when they brought Tom down, is that right? That's what my reading was suggesting, that I think Tuvok was involved more initially in the draft that you'd written, and then that somewhere the decision was made, no, we want to make this about the Tom B'Elanna will they won't they relationship. And so it was, while they were shooting, there was kind of rewriting going on. Is that right? Would that be a normal thing?
I don't recall it that way, actually. I remember it being Tom and B'Elanna pretty much the whole time that we were breaking the story. Tuvok obviously had to be involved, as a Vulcan and sort of explaining what was going on. But I believe he was always going to be up on the ship dealing with Vorik and the Doctor.
This could be like when you get interviews with people that rely on their Wikipedia pages and, half the information is wrong. Could be someone at Memory Alpha.
Wikipedia is not always the most reliable thing.
No, spreading unreliable stories. Okay, well, that's interesting to know. But speaking of the Tom and B'Elanna thing, this is around the time I think you were also credited as a story editor. As well as a scriptwriter, in a story editor on every episode, presumably. What does that involve? Is that similar to what we have over here these days? You have a script editor. Is it a kind of continuity responsibility? What is it? A kind of a pass over everything for quality? I mean, what does that role involve?
Well, it doesn't involve any more responsibilities. It's basically getting a promotion. It's just getting promoted from staff writer to story editor to executive story editor to co-producer. But it doesn't really involve separate responsibilities. Like, you don't actually go through and do a grammar edit or anything like that on the script. It's really just you have one more year of experience.
Oh, I see. Okay, so all these titles are kind of. Slightly, they remind me. There's that DS9 episode where there's a Bajoran, and they have to give him a role, and they come up with this role of Navark, and no one knows quite what it means, but it's it's impressive.
Yeah, it's kind of like that.
That's interesting. Okay, so it doesn't mean. You see, I was imagining that maybe it meant you were kind of the one checking that from week to week, because presumably someone must be doing that, checking that from week to week, relationships are kind of in the same place, and we haven't, got people together 1 week and then forgotten we got them together the next or whatever.
Well, that's something that we all kept track of as a staff, and that, we had,
that's interesting.
We were the ones that kept track of the continuity, basically. And if we, I guess, made a huge mistake, then the script coordinator or the script supervisor would tell us about it.
And I did notice watching your episodes, there are quite a lot of quite meaty Tom and B'Elanna scenes. Was that just a coincidence, or was that something that you kind of lent into? Because a lot of even if they're kind of inconsequential scenes, they feel again, I suppose that sense of being interested in the character dynamics. It may not even be the B story. It may just be a kind of a filler scene, but it feels like they're sort of advancing that story. And I suppose that's what I mean about the serialization that is kind of drip fed through different episodes. Actually, just watching your episodes, you get quite an insight into that relationship and how it develops.
Well, I definitely was interested in that relationship. Again, Blood Fever did kind of kick it off. And so I felt a little bit more invested in it, maybe. And, we all really liked, the elements of continuity that carried from one episode to the next. Even though each episode is written to be a standalone, that you could sort of watch it out of order and still know what was going on. I think we were all fond of the elements that carried over from one episode to the next.
And you worked on, in this period, I'd say you worked on some real sort of fan favourite episodes. I mean, Message in a Bottle, the Omega Directive. These are, so much fun, these episodes. I'm kind of curious. There's also a couple that it seems to me the kind of fan response to them has shifted maybe over time. I'm thinking of Displaced and also Retrospect. And I don't know whether that's something that you're kind of aware of, particularly Retrospect. I mean, I think Displaced is a little bit more of an ambiguous one, but certainly some people I know have issues with that episode. But Retrospect is one that I find watching it today is very difficult because it seems to be saying something quite uncomfortable. And I'm sure that's not what the intention was when you wrote it, but I'm curious how that comes about and how you feel about that. If something you've written is sort of taken a certain way, years down the line, what that's like.
Yeah, no, retrospect has not aged particularly well. I mean, especially in the Me Too era, it really could be misinterpreted. I mean, originally it was inspired by actually the McMartin's pool case, where the kids had sort of had these repressed memories that had been, uncovered. And it was all these horrible things about like satanic rituals and abuse and all that kind of thing that turned out not to be true. And so we kind of took that. And there was also a psychologist, Elizabeth Loftus, at the time had come out with all those studies about how easy it was to sort of induce memories that had never happened, even in adults, not only kids, but, to tell an adult, oh, do you remember this incident from your childhood? And to induce them to remember this thing that had never happened when they were kids. And so we took that and thought, what if that happened to one of our characters? That they had a repressed memory that was recovered and it turned out not to be true. That's really where it started. And so the fact that it had a parallel to sexual assault was kind of the secondary storyline, the secondary element that was kind of grafted onto what was supposed to be a story about memories. And unfortunately, as I said, I think that the episode has not aged very well.
I wonder whether it's sort of a case of, we were talking about this idea of Star Trek doing allegory as a way of storytelling. And it's almost like you've got two allegories there and they're sort of working against. So you've got the story, that's the surface level of the story that's taking place in 23, whatever, in the future in space. And then you've got one allegory that's doing one thing and another allegory that's doing another. Because, the sexual assault stuff is, I would say it is there. In terms of the language of violation and the fact, the way that some of those scenes play out. I don't know. I just wonder, is that a case of drawing too much on that real world stuff, on that kind of, for a sort of reality? It grounds the episode, but then it ends up making it quite uncomfortable, the direction that it goes in, because it seems to be on the wrong side of the issue. I suppose that's the problem with it.
That is a problem with it. I can see how it would be misinterpreted. That, we shouldn't have believed her. But again, that really was not the intent of the episode at all. The intent was that it was going to start with a false memory. And could one of our characters be convinced that something that didn't happen actually happened? And in retrospect, obviously I would have chosen a different storyline for that. Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm just curious, at the time, was there any kind of anxiety about it or about the sensitivities there? Or was it just a case of everyone was like focused on this is what we're doing and didn't really see that coming? Do you know what I mean? I really think it was that we were focused on the story that we were trying to tell and didn't really consider, how is it going to be interpreted 25 years from now? So if you were telling that story today, you would basically stick with the recovered memory side of it, but lose all the sexual stuff in a sense, or not the sexual stuff, but the kind of, that's interesting. Yes, I would. Whereas I guess a lot of people might just not touch it with a barge pole. These days people are very, cautious, aren't they, about these sort of things? But that's an interesting one. Tell me about 7 of 9, because she's a fascinating character and, but also quite a contradictory one in ways that to some degree tie into, maybe one of the reasons that episode has that sexual dimension is how sexualized she is as a character. There must have been discussions in the room about this new character. At what point was it clear she was going to be dressed like that and she was going to be kind of made up like that and so on? Had you been conceiving storylines for her before that visual aspect of it was made apparent, if you know what I mean? And did that influence the storylines going forward? Yes. We talked about the character again without the visuals, and really considered her as, the former Borg and, the sort of the interesting elements of that, which I still think that she was really a great character and that the actress did a wonderful job with her. I think that the choice of outfit was kind of unfortunate. It's interesting. In some ways, maybe that's just as well that you had a vision of this character in your minds before seeing that, because that enabled you to write, as you say, a complicated, interesting, dynamic character, almost despite the surface level. But I suppose it does make me feel it's one of those, and these happen in Star Trek frequently, where there's a kind of a slight, maybe conflict's the wrong word, but there are different elements pushing in different directions, and the writers are maybe pushing one way and then there's producers pushing another. I assume that's what was going on with 7, was,
I think Rick Berman was the one who was keen for her to be a babe, right? And so there's this kind of pressure coming from that direction. How was that sort of handled? I mean, how did, and say for Jerry as a woman running that room, I mean, was that a difficult kind of dynamic to manage at times? Because Voyager obviously was a kind of very feminist show in some ways, and this was a slightly sort of anti-feminist gesture, at least on the face of it.
I don't remember having an awful lot of conversations about that because, again, we were looking at the character from a different point of view. We were just concentrating on how to use her in stories and how to make her dramatically interesting. And, the costume choice was kind of, maybe it was in the back of our minds somewhat, but, and of course, Jerry is a beautiful woman. And so that was probably in the back of our minds as well. But, I mean, just speaking for myself, I mean, my focus was really on how can we make her more interesting. And the fact that she was not a Starfleet character gave her a lot more leeway to be to confront the captain, to disagree with the captain, and to have a lot more conflict with our characters, which really made her for a very interesting character, because most of our guys were supposed to get along with each other because they were all Starfleet.
And actually, I think, again, going back to this idea of continuity, season 4 of Voyager, many people would say is the best season of Voyager. And I think a lot of it is because of the way 7 is introduced and that kind of thread running through the season. And obviously, some people complain that Voyager kind of becomes the 7 of 9 show, or the 7 and the Doctor show, that those characters kind of, a bit like Data in Next Gen, become so popular and so central that they sort of steal focus. But I think in that season, it absolutely works that, she's this new character. We've got to get to know her. And we really do see her change quite a lot over the course of those episodes, to the point where, in the Omega Directive, for example, she is so tempted to disobey orders, but she doesn't. And it's quite an interesting transition that you reach with that episode. I think that you get 7, doing something that she would not have done at an earlier point in the season.
Well, I really like the relationship between 7 and Janeway. I thought that really worked very well. With Janeway as a mentor figure and almost like a mother figure, and Janeway and 7 being sort of the rebellious teenager who does come to appreciate that the captain has a point, and really should be the captain that really is in charge. That
relationship is fantastic, I think. And it really surprised me to learn years later that, that the two actresses were really not getting on at this point, and yet they were able to play this kind of growing bond. Was that something that in the writer's room you're aware of, if there's a kind of tension on set and that you have to deal with, or do you just kind of, that's not your business, and get on with it?
You kind of have to set it aside, and really focus on what, telling the good stories and using the characters to the best of your ability.
And what was it then that made you choose to leave Voyager towards the end of that season? I mean, it was around the same time that Jerry was leaving. Was there kind of a sense that was sort of closing a book, and obviously Brannon was going to take over, and it was going to be, I mean, was there an idea the show was kind of going to be revitalized in some ways or go in some new direction? I suppose it did go in more of a kind of action-adventure direction after that in some ways.
A little bit. Also, I mean, Star Trek was the only thing that I had ever done professionally, and it was, kind of wanted to see what else was out there and what else I could do.
Before we go, Lisa, give our listeners an idea of what you've been up to recently. I mean, we know you're back in the Star Trek universe with the Explorer magazine. Are we going to see more writing from you on Trek? I know you've been writing novels in the last few years. Do you think, is a Trek novel something that would ever appeal to you? Or even going back to, Trek is back on the small screen in a big way. I mean, is that something that would still appeal to you, to go back to that sandbox?
Well, the Star Trek sandbox is a whole lot of fun to play with. I would definitely plan to do more short stories for the Star Trek Explorer magazine. Yeah, I'd be happy to go back and work on another Trek show. I love Picard, I love Discovery. But at this point, I'm trying to create my own material, my own screenplays and my own pilot scripts for my own series and novels. And so working on original material is pretty much where I'm focusing right now.
Fantastic. Well, we'll look forward to hearing about it and seeing it, whatever form it might take. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you for having me.
You're blended, all right.